Amarillo, Texas, a city with more than 200,000 people in the Panhandle. A city known for a handful of tourist locations, mad cow disease, the fact that we have 20,000 plutonium cores buried underground, and one really good song. Amarillo by morning. But what I really want people to know about my town is the fascinating history behind the death of its downtown area. How did this once bustling shopping epicenter become a ghost town? In this video, I'm going to dispel all of the local myths around this subject and just give you the facts. In order to understand why this downtown area failed, we have to understand why it became a thing in the first place. Given how isolated and disconnected the city is, the absolute lack of any natural beauty, and the completely unbearable weather, it's actually pretty shocking that this city really became a thing in the first place. Obviously, Greater Amarillo has a lot of manufacturing, cattle, and commercial railroads, but there's not really much here currently that explains why the downtown area popped up in the first place. Starting in 1910, a passenger train was constructed in what we now call downtown Amarillo, although there wasn't really much there then, that connected people to major cities such as Chicago. As I'm sure you can imagine, this was a pretty large influence on the growth of the downtown area. In the 1930s, the federal government granted Amarillo a large sum of money to create contracting jobs for the Amarillo area. Some of this work including creating the brick roads in the downtown area, which currently are falling apart, and if you drive more than 20 miles an hour on them, you'll do some damage to your car. In 1942, as a result of World War II, the Amarillo Army Airfield was opened up. In the 1950s, this was repurposed as an Air Force base. This base resulted in some pretty explosive growth for Amarillo's population. In 1940, the population was just over 50,000. By 1960, the population had gone well over 130,000 people. After 1960, Amarillo's growth came to a screeching halt. Now, I've got to be honest, this is kind of where I ran into a dead end because it's very difficult to find information on why this happened, but I have a sneaking suspicion. The population growth between 1930 and 1960 also happened to coincide with the oil boom in a town called Borger, about 50 miles northeast of Amarillo, whose population also plummeted in 1960. I also don't think it's a coincidence that a town with a railroad connecting to a town that discovered oil suddenly gets an Air Force base pop up, although that's my theory, but until someone gives me better information, I'm sticking to that. Then with the Air Force Base closing in 1968, that was likely the final nail in the coffin for Amarillo's population boom, as well as a major decrease in the federal funds that the city was likely receiving at the time. If you read the local newspapers, you can see from store owner interviews that the downtown area was rapidly declining by the 1970s. The streets were getting filthy, the crime was going up, and parking was becoming a nightmare. Now, parking is the second biggest factor in downtown Amarillo's failure. Now, I mentioned at the beginning of the video that Amarillo is a very isolated town. There are no other cities adjacent to Amarillo, the closest city being Lubbock, which is about 2 hours away, making the development of inter- and intra-city passenger trains or other forms of public transportation highly unfeasible. Having said that, there are hundreds of very small towns surrounding Amarillo with anywhere from 100 to a few thousand people. In a talk I recently heard from a United Way relationship manager in Amarillo, there's about 100,000 people in these areas who will either shop, dine, or receive their medical care in the Amarillo area. Combining the impracticality of large-scale public transport with the massive influx of out-of-town traffic, you create a highly car-centric city. Even by the 1970s, parking in downtown Amarillo had already become a huge problem. And it didn't help that in 1968, the Western Plaza Mall opened up, and they pulled all of the stops. Air conditioning, free bus rides, it was even bigger than the Dallas Mall, and did I mention they had lots of parking? Alas, even this mall faced the same demise as downtown Amarillo because by the 1980s, Westgate Mall had been opened up on the western side of town, and this had become the preferred place to shop. And I don't think it's a coincidence that they have a pretty significant amount of parking. Which brings us to today, where even Westgate Mall is pretty slow even on a Saturday afternoon. Shopping has shifted even further to the west side of town on roads like Soncy. Classic case of urban sprawl. And why wouldn't you sprawl when land is dirt cheap and you can get a house for half the price of the national average? Amarillo has the same problem in the restaurant industry. All too often, a new restaurant will open up and it'll be booming for a year, maybe even 2 years, but then a newer, cooler restaurant opens up down the road and it's game over. Things slow down very quickly. The longevity of the retail and service industry in Amarillo seemed to be doomed to the nature of the town's geography. And I can't really think of any reason to tell people not to develop on cheap land, except for maybe the aquifer's dwindling water supply, which really cannot support the city's growth long term. But let's be honest, if anybody here cared about sustainability of the economy or the water supply, they wouldn't be here. As for the commuter train station that I mentioned earlier, that shut down decades ago along with hundreds of other train stations across the country due to lack of use. And the city has tried making downtown more viable by expanding bus networks as far back as the 1970s, but people don't really ride the buses. So it's not that Amarillo hasn't made any attempts to mitigate its car dependency, it's just that all of these attempts have never really worked. Now earlier I said we have one really good song. Actually, make that two.
Is this the